Okay, I find myself able to make a video about Fanny Hill, Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. So here it goes. We're reading the second volume, which is the second letter. And a lot of the things that I said or didn't say about the first volume that I was allowed to talk about in very circuitous ways, I would say about the second volume also. So let me start with the very beginning of the second volume, which is on page 90, I think. Fanny writes, "Madam, if I have delayed the sequel of my history, it has been purely to afford myself a little breathing time, not without some hopes that, instead of pressing me to a continuation, you would have acquitted me toward the task of pursuing a confession." We're very interested in the word confession. "In the course of which my self-esteem has so many wounds to sustain." Okay. And then she goes on to talk to this unnamed recipient of the letters about what she did and what she didn't do and how it turned out. And I would like to talk about on Friday the ways in which this situates her as a writer of an epistolary fiction, specifically in terms of Pamela. As you know, I am obsessed with reading this novel as a revision of Pamela, though they have slightly different subjects. But that's the first thing. Then I want to think about the fact that Mrs. Cole here is really a very maternal and very protective presence, unlike Mrs. Brown, right, in the first volume, who is this Mrs. Jukes type person. So here we get more of like a Mrs. Jarvis type person. So we get the evil woman and the good woman played out again in this novel. Okay. We've got Fanny's already backstory from volume 1. Here she meets the delightful women in the house, Emily, Harriet, and Louisa. And we get their backstories also. And I want to talk about how their backstories position women as naive or knowing, and how that relates to Pamela, who I mentioned before does seem to know a lot about sex, actually. She knows as soon as her parents mention her jewel, what that actually means and how someone might take it. These women, girls, are more naive than that, a lot more naive than that, except you'll have to remind me. I think it's Louisa, who has a much stronger sex drive than the other women in the novel, which is kind of thrilling. Okay, so we get their stories, which I'm fascinated by also, because just formally, it's an epistolary novel where our narrator is writing to someone else, but writing also these stories that someone else has told her. So she's sort of writing their biographies at the same time. Okay. And then they have sex with a bunch of people. I mentioned this in class on Wednesday, but she does see 2 men having sex with each other at one point. This was the only point in the novel at which she is absolutely repelled. She finds it disgusting and against nature. Even though she herself almost has anal sex with a man, it's not so much that as it is specifically to do with 2 men, both of them being male and penis having males, penis having men. Okay. That is repellent. She's welcome to have, or happy to have sex in a variety of ways with a variety of people. And specifically on, well, there's a lot of specificallys, so let me just jump ahead to the end of the book, or almost the end. On page 171, she says to the recipient, the madam, who's receiving the letters. That's a nice play that I just realized, Madam and Madam. At the same time, allow me to place you here an excuse I am conscious of owing you for having perhaps too much affected the figurative style, though surely it can pass nowhere more allowably than in a subject which is so properly the province of poetry. Nay, it is poetry itself. She's saying, I'm sorry if I've made this all so overly flowery or whatever, but if this is like poetry, which maybe sex is, then maybe that's an excuse. Okay. Poetry itself, pregnant with every flower of imagination and loving metaphors like machine and pearls of whatever, all of the metaphors that she's used to describe sex, penises, semen, vulvas, vaginas, all the other things one imagines in porn. Even were not the natural expressions for respect of fashion and sound necessarily forbid it. She couldn't have used the real words. Okay. All right, Fanny. We'll just go along with you there. Closer to the end, on 187, we notice a couple of things. One is that she's rich now, score. Another is that she gets Charles. She gets the man whom she fell in love with, who took her virtue, and who here is like, it's okay, baby. We all go crazy once in a while, yeah. And comes back and he marries her and she goes on to have babies and gets her happy ending. So at the beginning of the book, she's naive, more naive than Pamela. She's taken to London. She's at a loss. No one will help her. She's not abducted, but she's in the hands of someone who's like Mrs. Jukes. She's mistreated. She somehow finds her love in a whorehouse, which is a good strategy for those of you trying to find true love also. And then she has all of these adventures that, as I mentioned before, we might normally attribute to a male protagonist. And then at the end, Charles comes back, she finds Charles, and they're able to set up this happy, normal, loving relationship just the way Pamela is. And many of her friends, Emily, Louisa, Harriet, end up pretty well also. They're not punished, right? They're not killed the way they should be killed, or forever shamed the way they should be shamed. They're fine. In fact, she says on 187, she says to Madame, I could not help pitying, even in point of taste, those who immersed in a gross sensuality are insensible to the so delicate charms of virtue, than which every pleasure has not a greater friend, nor than vice a greater enemy. It's a story about virtue. You laugh perhaps at this tailpiece of morality, tailpiece is funny also, expressed from me by the force of truth resulting from compared experiences. You think it no doubt out of place, out of character. Possibly too you may look on it as a paltry finesse of one who seeks to mask a devotee of vice under a rag of a veil, impudently smuggled from the shrine of virtue. Okay, what she's saying here, and she's using interesting figurative language, is that her commitment to virtue is actually real. She realizes now that it's true love and Charles and the first one, and the first love that really makes you happy, and that she's happier now than she was in all the stuff we just read, which is kind of hard to believe. So in this sense, I wonder whether it reads the way Moll Flanders did. And I'm not sure that it's not more like Pamela, but it might even be a combination of the two. Okay, that's a lot to think about, maybe, while you read the second volume of, I almost said Moll Flanders, of Fanny Hill, considering that 98% of it is just descriptions of sex. So maybe think about it academically if you can. And if you can, these are some ways to think about it. Okay,